Now is the best time to start playing TCG Pocket because a new expansion recently dropped called the Space Time Smackdown, which released an additional 155 new cards to an ever-expanding roster. And I'm sure that you guys might have heard people say, "This game is pay to win." I don't normally spend as much money on packs as most creators do, because I'm broke, baby. But I'm doing pretty okay so far. So if you think you need to spend a lot of money in this game to compete, let me change your mind on that. Here are some updated and new budget decks for you that will help you stand your ground against the current meta without ever breaking your bank. So first things first, when you say budget decks, of course Blading decks are going to be the first thing that comes into mind. Since release, Blading decks have always been a popular budget-friendly option that can work surprisingly well against meta decks, as the deck revolves around early and cheap aggressive options alongside heavy firepower. The core cards of this deck revolves around Rapidash and Ninetales as the main Pokemon to use, as they synergize well with Blaine for an unexpected burst of damage. And the strategy is pretty straightforward. You want to just create early game pressure with Rapidash and Ninetales, and then catch people off guard with huge bursts of damage from Blaine. Like seriously, this deck is pretty easy to pilot, and I can't just tell you how many times I've ever won with this deck. It's just super easy to win with this one. Unfortunately, Blaine decks struggle if you don't establish your strong early game early on, which can also happen sometimes even if you start with a bad hand. If you want to make some replacements, you can add the other variant of Rapidash found in the Mythical Island pack, but on the other hand, you can also add Farfetch if you want more early game aggression as well. Fighting decks have gotten a lot more love recently given the amount of flexible options you can have when building one. Like for example, if you want to hit backlines, you have Hitmonlee. If you want to take trades, you have Marshadow. Or if you just want to be silly, you can, I don't know, you can use this thing. Unlike the Blaine deck, this deck is slightly slower but specializes early to mid-range aggro, starting Lucario as the main core of the deck. Lucario works as a support to all fighting decks, being able to give 20 plus damage to active fighting Pokemon. And unlike Superior, this effect can stack with another Lucario in the bench, so you are able to actually give allies plus 40 damage instead. There's nothing much for me to say about strategy, you just want to have Lucario up and ready as fast as possible so you can do crazy amounts of damage for cheap. And of course, like any fighting deck, you might have a hard time if you run into Psychic decks like Mewtwo X or even the recent Mismagius X. If you want to add alternate cards to this deck, I'd recommend that you use Rampados. Being able to do 130 damage for one energy alone is pretty crazy, and with the additional 20 plus damage from Lucario, you'll be able to one-shot most mons in the format, like Darkrai X and Palkia X, both seeing a lot of play recently. I'm also having a lot of fun with Dugtrio, Aerodactyl X, and Gallade X. All of them synergize pretty well with Lucario, so feel free to experiment and see what works best for you. During the making of this video, the current meta is running rampant of Weavile and Darkrai X decks. And while normally the top solution to this would be Yanmega X, not everyone, and including myself, is lucky enough to pull it. In this case, you can play a simple grass deck from the current expansion consisting of Roserade and Kricketune. It's a good cheap solution for those unable to break the bank pulling for meta cards. Within the introduction of the new status conditions, this deck capitalizes on the new Confusion status thanks to Kricketune, as well as the ability to stack Confusion alongside the Poison status from Roserade. Alongside some tool cards we have in the deck and healing cards, your Pokemon can be surprisingly resilient as long as no one one-shots them. Unfortunately for this deck, both Kricketune and Roserade are extremely weak in terms of damage, both being only able to do up to 50 damage maximum. The Confusion mechanic is also a little bit of a coin flip as well, as you are more reliant on landing hits to survive for longer. In addition, Fire-type decks like the Blaine decks and Charizard decks are super strong against in general, so if you run into one, you're going to be having a really hard time. If you want something a little bit more challenging to pilot, maybe something that requires a bit of skill to win with, then may I introduce to you an underrated favorite deck of mine that I recently fell in love with, and it's a deck that revolves around the three Late Guardians, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azef, which all three are relatively easy to acquire if you roll for the newest booster set. All three each synergize well with each other. Uxie helps generate energy for the 2 every turn, Azef does damage across the board, and Mesprit simply wipes an entire continent with its damage for only 3 energy, which is pretty cool. The deck also features Giratina as an alternative frontline just in case you don't get Uxie in the opening hand, but essentially you want Uxie in the front to ideally pump Mesprit with energy until it has enough to one-shot most X-Mons like Dialga X and Palkia X. If you damage enemies in the bench with Azelf, you can drag them out to the front thanks to Cyrus as another way to control the board. The biggest weakness of this deck is that it can be a little bit harder to pilot since Mesprit is locked behind a condition in order to use this move. The only way for Mesprit to be able to attack in the first place is to have the 2 other Guardians in the bench, so all 3 must be present and alive. The Late Guardians also have an absolutely pitiful HP stat, only being at 70 HP, which easily puts it in one-shot range from a lot of Pokemon. So this means you need to make strategical switches and trades if you want to make the most out of this deck. And if you want to add an alternative win condition, feel free to add Mew X from the Mythical Island set like this deck that I'm currently running. Just like the Blaine decks, Koga decks have also been a stable budget deck since release. But unlike its fire counterpart, Koga decks are a lot more slower in terms of playstyle, focusing a lot more on bouncing Weezing back into your hand as you slowly deal poison chip damage across the board. Because of this strategy, this deck is surprisingly resilient, being able to take down strong X mons like Mewtwo X if unchecked and underestimated. Because of the low cost mons like Arbok and Weezing, the deck itself is a deterrent against equally slow, if not slower decks, thanks to poison chip damage as well as being able to deny early switches. If you have Weezing in the active spot and you're close to getting knocked out, you can use Koga to bring it back to your hand, effectively healing all damage done to it. Unfortunately, the damage in this deck is a little bit pitiful, only the maximum being Arbok's corner for 60, which puts it in a very difficult position once stronger and tankier Pokemon enter the field, like Stage 2 or even some X-Mons. So once you have more cards, you can add in a few new ones to this deck to make it a lot more fun. Like for example, you can add in Wigglytuff X as an extra element to the deck due to Poison and Sleep being able to stack, or you can even replace the entire Arbok line with the Scolipede line for more damage and combo potential. Alright, you guys have been so good so far. I'm gonna be throwing in another extra deck just for you. Drawing in from the new set, this deck features Skarmory, Bastiodon, and the newly introduced Pokemon Tool cards. Because the only basic Pokemon in this deck is Skarmory, that means that you guarantee starting with it all the time. Plus, the abundance of tools in this deck, most of the time you'll end up with a very strong turn 1, with Skarmory being able to deal 50 damage with 1 energy as long as the tool is attached. In the meantime, you'll spend your turns drawing for the Armor Fossil in order to build Bastiodon, being the main powerhouse of the team. Bastiodon is a pretty fun Pokemon to play with, dealing okay damage for 3 energy, but the most fun thing about it is the possibility of avoiding 100 damage via coin flip. But unfortunately, I feel like that's also what's bad about this deck. While negating 100 damage is pretty good, there's always the reliance of coin flips, making the win condition of this deck a little bit inconsistent, as failing to block that 100 damage could really determine the outcome of a match. Personally, this deck is fine the way it is, but you can also feel free to replace Skarmory with Dialga X if you want more damage and energy ramp in exchange for weaker early game pressure. And that's pretty much everything. To recap, we just went through 6 fun budget decks for everyone to try out. While it may not be groundbreaking and meta-defying, these decks prove that you don't always necessarily need crazy pulls in order to win in TCG Pocket. So which deck are you the most excited to try out of all these decks? Or do you have your own secret budget deck? Let me know down in the comments below. But other than that, I hope you find some good use in these decks, and I'll see you guys all later. Alright, show's over! Get out of here, scram!